Today, we are going to break down one of history's most influential and, frankly, most notorious books, Mein Kampf. Our goal here is to do an objective analysis, looking directly at excerpts and ideas from the text itself to understand its core arguments, the world it came from, and the future it was trying to create. All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to follow the book's own narrative structure. First, we'll look at the crisis that the author claims prompted its creation. Then, we'll get into his diagnosis of what went wrong, his vision for a fix, and finally, the step-by-step plan he laid out to gain power.
So, first things first. To really get what this book is about, you have to understand the time and place it was written. The author is very clear that this isn't some abstract philosophy. It's a direct response to a specific moment in history.
And right there, in his own words, he tells you where it all began, in a prison cell. This was right after his failed attempt to overthrow the government in 1923, an event that you might know as the Beer Hall Putsch. So the book was literally born from failure and imprisonment.
You really can't understand this book without understanding this timeline. Think about it. The shock of losing World War I, the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles, then foreign troops literally occupying your industrial heartland. It was a period of absolute chaos and national despair. This is the world that created this book.
And that context is absolutely crucial. The author isn't just writing a book, he's framing it as an emergency response. He's saying, look, our nation is on the verge of total collapse, and here is the only way out.
Okay, so that's the what. Now let's get into the why. How exactly did the author diagnose this national sickness? Well, according to the text, the seeds of his analysis were planted years earlier when he was a young, struggling artist in Vienna. He paints this picture of Vienna at the turn of the century as a city just tearing itself apart. He describes seeing incredible, dazzling wealth right next to the most disgusting poverty. And for him, this city was like a laboratory where he could study everything he believed was wrong with modern society.
And this slide really gets to the heart of his political critique. He absolutely despised parliamentary democracy. He saw it as a system of anonymous majorities, where no one is ever truly responsible for anything. What he proposed instead was this aristocratic principle, a single leader, chosen by the people, who has absolute authority and takes absolute personal responsibility for every single decision.
So another one of the major villains in this diagnosis is Marxism. He claims he had this big revelation about it while working on construction sites, where he says he saw firsthand how social democratic unions operated. He came to see it as a pestilence, a disease designed to destroy civilization.
And this is where all those threads, his hatred of democracy, of Marxism, of modern art, start to converge on a single target. He claims that as he looked closer at all these different areas of life, from politics to the press to the arts, he started to see one group behind it all. And there it is. For the author, this was the moment the scales fell from his eyes. This claim was the key that, in his mind, unlocked everything. Suddenly, Parliament, Marxism, and all the social decay he saw weren't separate problems anymore. They were all symptoms of what he presents as a single, coordinated conspiracy.
So, once you've diagnosed all these problems, what's the solution? Well, the text doesn't just call for reform, it lays out a vision for a completely new, incredibly radical kind of state.
At the absolute center of this new vision is one thing: race. The author argues that the universe has one fundamental law, and that is the preservation of racial purity. To him, mixing races was the one unforgivable sin that would bring any civilization to ruin. And this belief completely flips the idea of what a state is even for. A state isn't just there to manage an economy or defend borders. Nope. According to this text, its main job is to be a vessel, a kind of racial incubator, whose sole purpose is to protect and promote its best racial elements and lead them to world domination. Okay, but you've got this wild, radical idea. How on earth do you get millions of people to buy into it? That's the next big, practical question the book tries to answer. And the answer it gives is propaganda. And is very specific about how it should work. He says, forget about intellectual arguments. Propaganda has to be aimed at the emotions. It needs to be brutally simple, endlessly repeated, and it must always, always present a single enemy to blame for everything. There's no room for nuance or complexity. All right, so you have the diagnosis, the vision, and the tool to sell it. What's the final piece of the puzzle? The actual concrete plan for taking over the state.
Step 1, according to the text, you don't create a polite political party that sits around and debates.
You create a fighting organization, a militant movement that is willing and ready to use violence to crush its political opponents, specifically the Marxists, on the streets.
And the plan isn't just about internal power. It calls for a complete overhaul of foreign policy. As you can see here, France is identified as the #1 enemy that has to be isolated and destroyed. And how do you do that? By forging alliances with Great Britain and Italy, who he saw as natural rivals to French power in Europe. But here's the real kicker. Those alliances weren't the end goal. They were just a means to an end. And this quote spells out exactly what that end is: conquest. The ultimate aim was to seize new territory in Eastern Europe for German settlement. This idea of Lebensraum, or living space, is presented as an absolute necessity for the nation's survival.
To justify all of this, the book lays out what it claims is the enemy's own secret plan for world conquest. It's presented as this long, historical conspiracy that his new movement has been created to stop and defeat.
So, when you put it all together, the street fighting, the propaganda, the foreign policy, it all points to this one final vision: the creation of a new kind of state, built entirely on a foundation of race that is destined to take its place as the dominant power on the planet. And that really is the central question this historical document leaves us with. It forces us to ask, under what conditions can a story like this, a story of crisis, decay, and promised rebirth, built on simple answers and radical solutions, actually take hold of an entire nation and change the course of history?